Well, it's great to be with you. Not preached in this church before, and you haven't had me preaching to you, so new experience for all of us. When I was growing up, I used to like stories about people who could so disguise themselves that they could be completely convincing and nobody would know who they were. I started with Enid Blyton, who wrote stories about the five find-outers, and Fatty, one of them, used to disguise himself, and that was exciting. And then moved on to Baroness Orczy, who had this character who was called the Scarlet Pimpernel, and he rescued lots of people, the people who were otherwise destined for the guillotine during the French Revolution. And when he was in France, you wouldn't know that he was an Englishman, spoke perfect French, and he was always in disguise. But when he was back in England, he was Sir Percy Blakeney, this very, very posh, very sort of drawling and apparently foolish man with enormous wealth. And then there was Sherlock Holmes. And remember, Sherlock Holmes could even dress up and be so convincing that his friend Dr. Watson didn't know who it was. And I tell you all that because there's a real sense in which Jesus was a man in disguise. And this passage uncovers that in a real way. But of course, the difference between him and Sir Percy Blakeney or any of the others was that he was really God and really a man. He was both utterly and completely, not just God dressed up or something like that. And this passage tells us that because the three disciples, Peter, James, and John, were taken by Jesus up this mountain in the north of Israel, in the sort of Galilee region. And there, as the passage told us, Jesus was transfigured. And all the gospel writers who record this, and he mentioned, of course, in our 2 Peter reading as well, they all struggle to convey what it was like. And it's really important to be able to imagine things in the Bible. And just think for a moment. Matthew says he was so covered in light and brightness that it was like looking at the sun. And sorry, I've sort of left out a little bit of what I was going to say. I'll just go back a minute. If you could go back to the no, that's fine. You go back to the caterpillar. Thank you. The point was, what I was meant to say, and I didn't, was that the word that, when Matthew was struggling to say this, the word he used was what gives us our English word metamorphosis. So it comes from the Greek word, but it actually means this complete change. And if we could see the butterfly now, then you'll. I mean, we know this is the case, that the butterfly comes from the caterpillar. But if you could see them together, you couldn't believe it. And it was like that. That's the word he uses, and that's what it felt like. And as he said, it was like the brightness of the sun. So we could go on to the sun now. Yeah, and we know that if we try to look at the sun, we have to turn our eyes away very rapidly. And it was like light. Just imagine a human being, just so covered in brightness and light that you couldn't look at it. And the light, of course, was a sign of God, because God is light, and John tells us that Jesus was the true light that gives light to every man. And these three men, had only seen Jesus looking like an ordinary human being in disguise. And now he was revealed in his glory, in his majesty, in a way that they'd never seen before. And it was utterly amazing. And then they see him joined by these two other figures. And I don't know how they knew, but they knew that it was Moses and Elijah. And if you think about it, Moses and Elijah had been dead for centuries. And here they were seeing two people they knew had died centuries before standing with Jesus in this brightness on the mountain. And the next thing that happens is they're covered in cloud. Now we're staying in Keswick at the moment in the Lake District, and we all know what happens sometimes on the fells. If you're walking, you have to be very careful that you don't suddenly get covered in cloud and you can't see where you're going or anything. And I think it was like that, except it was a cloud of brightness, and the picture sort of conveys it. A cloud of brightness surrounding them, and then they heard the voice. And again, Peter mentions that in his second letter. The voice which was like thunder, which was the voice of God. And they knew it to be the voice of God, and you'll remember what God said. This is my Son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And I always think that last phrase is so important, isn't it? We're commanded, they were commanded, but we too, to listen to the voice of God. And so they knew without any doubt that the man they'd been living with, seemingly ordinarily, was in fact none other than God's one and only Son, loved by his Father. Many people think of Jesus as a good man and a good teacher, someone to learn from, but they don't believe him to be God. And they don't believe him to be the one and only Son, beloved by his Father. And I think it's quite helpful for us to recognize that the people who were there at the time, and again, Peter's letter witnesses to this as well as the passage in Matthew. These people who actually were there didn't have the slightest doubt that this person they were coming to know, this Jesus, was in fact God's Son, God on earth, as well as the man they knew. And added to that, I think it's really important that it was Moses and Elijah there, because they represented, Moses represented the law being given, and Elijah stood for all the great prophets of God. That is the Old Testament fundamentally. And what it was saying was that all that was written long before, and these two men represent it, was pointing forward to this Jesus who was God as well as man. And I think it's also important for us to remember and to rejoice in the fact that he was both God and man, because otherwise he could never have achieved the salvation that he came to bring. And we'll think a bit more about that before we finish. But do you remember what the reaction of those three disciples was once in the cloud, hearing the voice? They collapsed on the ground with fear. And is that surprising to us? I can't think of how utterly frightening it would be to be surrounded by this bright cloud, not be able to see anything else, and hear that voice speaking. And then the cloud goes, and Moses and Elijah have disappeared, and there's just Jesus looking as he always does. And that's a picture by Rembrandt of Jesus in one of the. I'm not sure it's an etching or a drawing that he's done. And then they talk as they come down the mountain, and they talk about Moses and Elijah, and they talk about John the Baptist. But we must move on. And it's very much coming down to earth at this point. Coming down to earth with the bump. This so often happens, isn't it? You have an exalted moment, and then the next thing you're brought down to earth. And it must have felt like that to Jesus, but also to his friends who were with him. And a man, as he comes down, and we see it in the pictures, couldn't we? A man comes rushing up and falls at his feet. And this man is in desperate straits. And I think it's really like, again, we need our imaginations, don't we? Because this man had a son, and the son had something within him of evil, which was causing him to dash into fire or into water, with all the damage that would do to him. And I sort of have this picture of the parents being on edge all the time, wondering what's going to happen. Is it going to happen again? Never being able to rest because your son's in this dreadful state. I mean, and those of you who are parents or have been parents, you will know what it's like when you have a child that's ill or a child that's in pain. We've got 3 sons. Our youngest son, when he was 12, had a burst appendix. And you'll know that that's quite serious. He had to go, he was in hospital and lots of antibiotics, a lot of operation and so on. And we were frightened, we were fearful. And you may have been in that sort of situation too. And then we all know what happens when you've got something wrong with you or there's some trouble in your life and you think there's an answer. And you come rushing to get the answer. But then you're disappointed. And that's what's happened to this man, because he's come to the other disciples hoping that they are able to cure his son. And oh dear, they haven't managed to do it. And so he comes to Jesus, who's the right person to come to, isn't he? And I think in some ways Jesus' reaction is quite surprising, because his first reaction is to say how frightful all these people were, not trusting God. We've already started thinking about faith in this. And he says, well, you just didn't trust God, did you? And that's the problem. And I think we sometimes get the wrong idea about trust. Trust is really seeing enough of God, enough of Jesus, to be convinced that if I pray, if I ask, if I walk depending on him, he will look after me, he will do what's needed. And I don't know about you, but I struggle to have faith. I'm not very good at depending on him. And it's only too possible for me to think I've achieved things by my own efforts rather than recognizing I always need God's help and I can never do anything without him. I mean, the Bible tells us, doesn't it? Without faith, it's impossible to please him. Only by trusting in God can we do anything of value. And I have to learn that lesson again and again, and maybe you do too. But it's good to remind ourselves that he's the dependable one, the one that we can depend on, and we are called to depend on him. And I think the problem with these disciples was that they were doing exactly that. They were depending on themselves rather than on God. And that's not the way we want to go. There's this story which I rather love, which is about a missionary in Thailand. And he's taking a film to show to some a village which he's never visited, which never had anything about Christ. He's taking a film about Jesus to that faraway village. And as he's driving up the track to it, they meet a tree. And there's a tree right across the track. There's no way round it. And what to do? It's a bit like when you get the road closed notice that suddenly your heart drops when you're driving and it's road closed. And he's with some Thai people, and one of them says, "You've been telling us about Jesus and how powerful he is, all the things he can do. Don't you think we should ask him to move the tree?" And the missionary, sort of rather sheepishly, eventually he speaks a prayer asking God to act into this situation. Well, the tree doesn't suddenly disappear, but they go off to another village which they want to visit, and they show the film. And meanwhile, a strange thing happens. An elephant comes from far, far away through the jungle until it reaches where the tree is. It's come without its master, and its master is sort of trying to follow it and find out where it is. And eventually the master arrives, and there is the elephant, and there is the master, and the Land Rover reappears, and there's an elephant which in Thailand was quite capable of moving a tree. And so the tree is moved. And suddenly the missionary realizes that his rather feeble prayer has been answered by a great and powerful God, bringing an elephant to move it. And I think it's an encouragement to us. However, Jesus says it, doesn't he? You only need enough faith. There's a tiny little seed of mustard seed and God will act. It encourages us to trust him and not ourselves. And of course, Jesus doesn't leave the man without help. He calls on the demon to leave him. The boy is restored. And I love the fact that it says he was healed at that moment. With Jesus, it's true the tree didn't disappear at that moment, but it did in the fullness of time. But this one was no partial healing. And you can imagine the joy in that household when that evening came. But we haven't reached the end of our passage, and I'm going to read you verses 22 and 23 again. When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. And this comes together with what we've read earlier in verse 12, when Jesus says to them, "But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they didn't recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." And the disciples realized that he was talking about John the Baptist and Herod, but actually Jesus was headed for the same fate. And this is Jesus emphasizing that he came from glory in heaven to be a man on earth, as a man to die. And the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Philippians, he says, "And being found in appearance as a man," which what Jesus appeared to his disciples, "he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross." And that was the whole purpose of his life, so that we could be rescued from the terrible disease of sin. And this is Rembrandt's picture of Jesus on the cross, to remind us. And what the passage as a whole shows us is much about Jesus, And it's in grasping the truth about him that we'll be able to trust him with our lives and live in that dependence he calls us to. And we've seen him in his heavenly glory in that transfiguration, together with the testimony of God proclaiming him as his only Son and calling people to listen to him. And this is the reality. Jesus is the one and only, the unique man who was God and holy man. And then at the end of the passage, we see a different kind of glory. And I think it's just worth reminding you of what Jesus says in the prayer that John records in his gospel. The prayer before his crucifixion. Jesus said these words, "Father, the time has come, glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." He's calling on God to glorify him, not by being transfigured on a mountain, as we've seen in this passage, but by his death on a cross of shame. The glory comes from the achievement of a purpose conceived before the foundation of the world, the salvation of humanity. And how grateful we should be for a Saviour who didn't cling to the glory of heaven, but was willing to go to the glory of the cross. How grateful we should be that when he came as a man, he cared enough about those he met to heal their infirmities and diseases. And these things go together. And I'm just going to read you some words from Isaiah which somehow hold all this together. "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted, but he was pierced by our transgressions. He was crushed by our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." He suffered so that we could live. We're called to trust him and walk his way. And we need to make sure that we are trusting him for forgiveness, for healing of our wounds of fear and pride and selfishness. And let's rejoice in him. Rejoice in the one who came from heaven, but rejoiced and was glorified in the cross. And may we learn to trust him more. May I learn to trust him more, to love him more, and to fix our eyes on him more as we go on in our lives. Let's pray that that may be so.